Today. Kevin Flaherty, college basketball analyst, men's basketball, and also getting interest because of his ability when it comes to scouting and more when it comes to football. Kevin Flaherty joins Craig and Paul, David Smoke on 365 Sports. Kevin, now that you see where the Big 12 is, there's, 3 games left. How many teams is reasonable for them to get into the tournament in the NCAA men's tournament?
I think right now you're looking at 9. If the season were to end today and, you said, okay, the NCAA tournament's tomorrow, there would be 9, and they would be 9 pretty solidly in. I think Texas is your 9th team in that scenario. Texas is looking like a 10 seed, probably a high 10 seed, not really on that 10-11 bubble right now. But those would be your 9 teams. And then you have 2 teams that are on the wrong side of the bubble kind of by a little bit, and that's Cincinnati and Kansas State. The one good thing about the Big 12 is it gives you a chance to make some statements, get some quad 1 wins. And so there is a chance, I think, for one of those 2 teams to maybe grab 1 or 2 of those to end the season, and then if they do something big in Kansas City, maybe put themselves into that discussion. But that's going to involve, a team like Kansas State going to Kansas and winning at Allen Fieldhouse. And I'm not saying that can't happen. Obviously, BYU did that earlier this week. But I do think that it's a little bit of a tall order for both Cincinnati and Kansas State right now. They're not just on the outside looking in, but they're not looking in directly from the window. They're looking in the window from across the yard.
Yeah, so let's just take Kansas State. If Kansas State beats Cincinnati and then loses at Allen Fieldhouse and loses to Iowa State at home, then do they need to win 2 games in the tournament, or would you say that they'd already be out?
I think they'd probably be out at that point. They would have a chance, obviously, with how strong the Big 12 is to ratchet up that resume in Kansas City. But at the same time, I'm not sure that they'd be able to do enough, other outside of obviously getting the league's auto bid by winning the tournament to get in at that point.
Kevin, we were just talking with Greg Wrubell, the voice of BYU, and just kind of getting his thoughts on not only that win against Kansas, but just their first year in the league. How surprised, if at all, have you been with what you've seen from the Cougars and just diving fully into the Big 12 the way that they have in hoops?
Yeah, I thought BYU would be better in football, and I thought BYU would be worse in basketball. When you look at their first seasons coming in and how they were going to fare, I did think that this is a basketball team that maybe had a chance to surprise a little bit, just because while they didn't have experience playing in the Big 12, it was the Big 12's most experienced team in terms of the number of guys that they brought back. And I think that's shown this year. When you look at the way that BYU plays, they're just so comfortable in what they do. And I think that there's something to be said about that. I'm thinking back to a big play that they had against Kansas, sort of in the clutch. It was a situation where they got the ball around the basket, and, Kansas guys are jumping all over the place to try and prevent the layup, and you see a kick out for an open 3 and a 3-point make. And a lot of teams aren't necessarily comfortable doing that in that situation. Not that they don't like open 3-pointers, but they feel like, hey, if we're within 2 feet of the basket and there's a chance here, why are we kicking that thing out? But BYU is an excellent passing team. The way that they move the ball, obviously the way that they shoot it, they hit 13 3-pointers in that game. I think their comfort level with who they are as a team, and Jackson Robinson being potentially, the Big 12 sixth man of the year, I think it's a deep, experienced group, and they're a team that, depending on how well they shoot in the NCAA tournament, they could win a game or 2.
Kevin, is Baylor good enough to be dangerous, or are they erratic enough to be out quickly?
Yeah, I think one of those things where you talk about a fire, right? Where a fire used correctly can heat your house, and if used incorrectly can burn your house to the ground. And I think that, when you ask if Baylor's dangerous, the answer is yes. The question is for who. And I think that Baylor is dangerous when you're looking at the Bears as a team that can take on the best of the league and therefore the best in the country. Even going back to the season opener against Auburn, and you look at the way that Baylor has played in stretches, against Kansas, against Houston, against, some of the other teams on that schedule. Yes, Baylor is very dangerous for opponents when Baylor is turned up in the right way and the right guys are playing, really well. I also think that Baylor is a team that like so many teams this year, it's an inconsistent team. And it's one that you look at the Michigan State game, obviously, you look at certain stretches in that same Kansas game and throughout the season, there are times where you look at it and you say Baylor should maybe be a little bit better right now than it's playing. And I think, the youth, not necessarily just, Baylor having a young team, but relying on newcomers the way that they are. Of course, a lot of people are in those same spots. That's going to happen, when you have guys that aren't used to your team's culture, that are coming in to college basketball, straight away when you look at a Jacoby Walter and an Yves Missy, obviously, but also a guy like Ray J. Dennis, who's coming in and has played a lot of basketball, but not at Baylor. You're going to hit some of those bumps in the road. And I think that's what makes Baylor maybe the Big 12's most interesting team heading into the final, week and a half of the season, Big 12 tournament, and then into the NCAA tournament, is this is still a team that I think has that potential deep run in them in the NCAA tournament. The question is, are they going to get there over the next couple weeks, or is it going to be something where you wind up saying, well, shucks, if the season was a month longer, maybe they'd get there.
Kevin Flaherty with us, college basketball analyst with us on 365 Sports.
Kevin, is this tournament going to be more? I mean, when you see UConn as good as they are, Purdue as good as they are, and I know that Matt Painter has to shake a really big tournament monkey off of his back when it comes to advancing. But you have these good teams like Houston at the top. Do you think when it comes down to the last weekend, we're going to see more of those high-seeded teams, or do you see more of a continuation of last year where that COVID year and the transfer portal and the veteran nature of all of college basketball creates more chaos like we saw in 2022 or 2023?
Well, there's kind of a truism out there in that whenever we think that, hey, the top of this sport is pretty settled is when you have a wild NCAA tournament. And whenever you feel like, hey, this is an NCAA tournament where you're going to see absolute carnage, a lot of times for whatever reason, that tournament turns out fairly chalk. And, I wouldn't said, maybe a week or two ago that there have only been two NCAA tournaments that I probably would have predicted if you would have given me, say, two teams versus the field, where I would have picked those two teams and said, okay, I'll take those two teams over the field. One of them didn't wind up happening, and that was in 2020, I would have taken Kansas or Baylor versus the field. I thought those were the two best teams in college basketball, and I thought that one of those two was going to cut down the nets. Ironically enough, the other time would have been the very next year. I thought Baylor and Gonzaga were the two best teams in the country by a fairly significant margin, and I would have picked those teams. If you offered me this year, you said, hey, it's Purdue and Houston, or, Purdue, Houston, and UConn versus the field. Let's even up it to three teams. I think I would probably take the field, but at the same time, it feels like every time we say that is when one of the favorites winds up, kind of running to the title.
Who is your player of the year in college basketball right now? Is it Edey at Purdue? Is that a given or somebody else?
It's Edey for me, although Dalton Knecht has made up about as much ground as I think you possibly can. It's so tough, though, because I think we've had so many discussions over the last few weeks about what Kevin McCullough means to Kansas, right? And he was a guy that was on sort of everybody's mid-season first-team All-America team, and since he's been out, Kansas has looked like a little bit of a different team, but they've still ultimately probably been an NCAA tournament team. You take, you take Zach Edey off that Purdue team, just act like he didn't exist, I'm not sure Purdue reaches the NCAA tournament. I'm not sure that Purdue has a really good team. And I like those guards. I think they've grown up a lot since last year. I don't think we're going to see another Fairleigh Dickinson type game because I do think that Braden Smith and those guys have gotten a lot better. But at the same time, Edey is such a huge part of everything that they do. And I think that with Tennessee, it's sort of a similar situation to McCullough. If you take Connect off that team, they probably become a usual Rick Barnes team, right? Like the type of team that defends really well, but quite frankly, on offense, they'd be better off punting the ball at the rim. And so it does change a bit, but I still think that Zach Edey, I think he's the best player this year. I also think that he's probably the most valuable player in terms of what he means to Purdue and what Purdue would be without him.
Kevin, great to have you on, man. We appreciate it. Hope to have you regularly between now, the tournament, and throughout. Kevin Flaherty, National College Basketball Analyst with us on 365 Sports. All right, we have